Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and we're going to cover quite a bit over the next 2 hours. Of course, this is coming up on President's Day, and we're going to talk about a new documentary on George Washington, which actually ties into one that we've talked about before with our friend Jerry Newcombe with Providence Forum on the Pilgrims. So we'll get into that in just a minute. Then at the bottom of the hour, we're going to get into some of the issues in the news. I posted an article which I called Trudeau and Truckers, but we're going to get into some more of those emergency orders, what that means, and the rest. Also posted a piece by our good friend Stephen Moore about under the pandemic and lockdowns, no surprise here, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer. We'll also get an update on what is happening at the border there between Ukraine and Russia, so we'll cover all of that in the first hour. Then in the second hour, we have our good friend Shannon Bream back once again. We'll talk a little bit about her previous book, her upcoming book, and also just some thoughts about what is coming down from the Supreme Court, because after all, she is chief legal correspondent for Fox News, and so we'll talk about that. And before the hour is up, we'll have our good friend E.W. Jackson, who, by the way, will also be with us at NRB to talk about a couple of issues. He's been over the last couple of days talking about everything from drug legalization to sending crackpots out, so we'll get into some of that as time goes on. Lots to cover, but first of all, we welcome back to the microphone Jerry Newcombe, Executive Director of the Providence Forum, but of course also the senior producer and on-air host of Truths That Transforms. An individual, of course, has been working for years and years and years with the ministry of D. James Kennedy, a graduate of Tulane University, Wheaton Graduate School, and holds his doctorate from Knox Theological Seminary, author of about 33 different books, 17 which were Dr. Kennedy, and about 80 different television documentaries. So, Jerry Newcombe, always great to have you on the program.
Thank you, Kerby. It's great to talk with you.
Let's, if we can, get into this, because George Washington's birthday coming up, and this is an opportunity for you to actually, through the Providence Forum, provide an opportunity for our listeners to learn a lot more about George Washington. And I know that it's good possibility that a lot of the great material in this documentary comes from your best-selling book, George Washington's Sacred Fire. But tell us about the documentary and how people can watch it.
Sure, and I want to mention this up front. Dr. Peter Lilback was co-author, of course, of the George Washington Sacred Fire. He's the one who founded Providence Forum. He's the president of Westminster Seminary, and about a year or two ago, he gave to D. James Kennedy Ministries, where I've been gainfully employed by the grace of God since the year of our Lord, 1985. I'm the longest-lasting, consistent employee of the D. James Kennedy Ministries, and I'm so happy. And one of my responsibilities now is related to Providence Forum, as for which I serve as the executive director. So it's kind of come around full circle. But I've been working on a series of films, basically 7, and these hour-long documentaries basically document the Judeo-Christian roots of America. In fact, the whole series is called The Foundation of American Liberty. And if anybody asks me, well, what's the foundation of American liberty? It's our Judeo-Christian heritage. Because without acknowledging that God is the creator and our rights come from God, the creator, we as a nation would lose our rights. We see that happening all over the place in all these other countries, where they basically jettisoned off any kind of Judeo-Christian roots in their particular nation. So this particular film is a documentary dealing with George Washington, and some of the guests include Cal Beisner, Bill Federer, David Gibbs III, Peter Loback, Jenna Ellis, the late Dr. Walter Williams, and Daniel Dreisbach. And we even dedicated the film to Walter Williams. He died while the film was in post-production, but he was a professor at George Mason University and quite a scholar. And so we appreciated what he had to say, and that he would be willing to, talk with with us about Washington. And the film itself, we basically deal with a kind of an overview of his life, but with a look at, the Christian influence, because a lot of times that's left off. I mean, for example, Dr. Peter Loback mentions that George Washington mentioned the name of Jesus Christ in a respectful way thousands of times in his life because, for example, he was a dedicated 18th century Anglican. With the rest of the congregation, he would stand up and recite the Apostles' Creed and the Lord's Prayer and say all these different prayers that invoke the name of Jesus Christ. George Washington was a regular and thorough reader of the Bible. He regularly read also the Book of Common Prayer, 1662. In our book, George Washington's Sacred Fire, we made the point that particular book, the Book of Common Prayer, 1662 version, is more orthodox than probably 95% of the books you would find in the Christian marketplace today, which is a sad state of where we are. But anyway, George Washington was not a deist. Some people like to say that he was, but the evidence points elsewhere. I mean, he referred people to God. He has more than 270 references to God. He liked to use the word providence. That's a term he used quite often. And providence is just another fancy way of basically saying God. He said in a very famous letter that is called the Circular to the States, which he wrote to all the different governors after the victory at Yorktown, but before the official surrender of the British, he said that unless we imitate the divine author of our blessed religion, we can never hope to be a happy nation. So, in other words, according to George Washington, the father of our country, if America doesn't imitate Jesus, how can we hope to be a happy nation?
And again,
Kerby, I've got two questions for you. Is America imitating Jesus?
Obviously not. Yes.
Is America a happy nation? No. Okay.
Good point. We need to take a break, but when we come back, we're going to get into a couple other issues. But let me give you some action items. First of all, we have a 3-minute trailer, so you can click on the picture there of Jerry Newcombe or go to this one for Providence Forum, and you will see that there's a 3-minute trailer of the George Washington film. Then you can watch it on such things as the NRB channel coming up here February 21st. Also, we have some links so you can see portions of that aired on Truths That Transform, which include, first of all, a whole section there on the Christian commitment of George Washington. You got quite a good, if you will, summary of that just a minute ago from Jerry Newcombe. And then a segment they also have on refuting the notion that George Washington was a deist. And those are going to be important because, first of all, those of you that are a little bit older, you may have not heard much about George Washington, or if you did, you might have heard in your classrooms that maybe he wasn't necessarily a Christian, and there were a lot of deists and Unitarians that were a part of the founding of the country. Wrong. But if you're younger, or your children or grandchildren have been going to school, if they hear anything about George Washington at all, it's that he was a slave owner and he was a flawed individual and a variety of others. So there is such a need to actually set the record right. And so when we come back, we're going to talk a bit more about this whole series, because we also in the past have talked about the series and the episode on the Pilgrims. So we'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Great Depression took place in the 1930s. Arthur Herman suggests that we refer to the first 2 years of the 2020s as the Great Confinement. He argues that just as the Great Depression changed the political landscape, so the Great Confinement will do the same in the next few years. We may be on the verge of a significant political realignment. The Great Depression destroyed American voters' faith in Wall Street and big business. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt described those stranded by the Great Depression as the forgotten man, while he and other Democrats were swept into office. The Great Confinement, in the form of lockdowns and mandates, might have a similar impact in the opposite way. Voters have lost faith in the basic competence of government. This time, the party out of office will enjoy the benefit of voter frustration. Roosevelt talked about the forgotten man. This time, the Great Confinement has created a nation of forgotten Americans. Polls already show a political and philosophical shift. 2/3 of Americans feel the country is on the wrong track. A recent Axios poll found that 2/3 of Republicans and more than 4 in 10 of Democrats said that they are fearful of what will unfold in 2022. I divide the cost of confinement into the 3 E's: economy, education, emotional. The economic cost of the pandemic and lockdowns is estimated at $16 trillion. Studies of student performance document the devastating impact of the lockdowns on learning and student achievement, and the emotional toll can be seen in the rising levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. Add to these statistics the rising crime rates and rising inflation rates, and you can see how we may indeed be on the verge of a political realignment. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes Dr. Jerry Newcombe, and again, we're talking about Providence Forum. So you can go to providenceforum.org, or we have a link to it on our website at pointofview.net. And some of you may wonder, well, now where can I see it? How can I watch the trailer? If you go down the first article there, one that was just posted today, keep up to date on the Foundation film series on America's Christian roots. And so then you can begin to see where you can watch this particular one on George Washington. If you scroll down a little bit longer, and you will also see the one that we've talked about in the past on the Pilgrims. There's a place which you can actually get your own copy through streaming at salemnow.com. So there's a number of places where you can either watch the trailer, and I would encourage you to watch it. It's only going to take you about 3 minutes. Then maybe hit that share button, send it to someone else that may also say, oh, I'd like to know something about this, so we can kind of maximize the impact. Because, Jerry, really the goal here is to return us back to some of the foundations of this country in terms of liberty. Yes, we have some very dark chapters in American history, the Indian Wars, slavery, and the rest, but there is a tendency for people to throw out all of our history and fail to realize that if we really want to have a foundation for this republic, certainly Christianity was important in the founding of this republic and the framing of this Constitution. I would think Christianity would be, by a logical implication, necessary in the maintenance of this republic. So this is one of the reasons why you've done this film series, isn't it?
It is. That was very, very well put. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, the founders drew a lot from the Judeo-Christian heritage. I mean, there's many ways in which one group of people really get overlooked in the whole history of America, and it's the Puritans. But every day, you and I enjoy freedoms as Americans. Pagans enjoy freedoms as Americans because of the Puritans being amongst us and spending time in the holy Word of God, and then applying principles of the Bible to law and to civil government and to civil liberties and, believe it or not, religious freedom. And the whole idea of the biblical concept of covenant ultimately gave rise to the American Constitution. And our two key founding documents as Americans are the Declaration of Independence, which says that our rights come from God, and then the Constitution, which is predicated on the Declaration of Independence, which says that our rights come from God. And it's no small point, because if you take away the Judeo-Christian foundation, then there's really no one else that you can appeal to. Like, for example, if you lived in a communist country and they just take away all your liberties or whatever, you can't appeal to anybody higher. There is no higher authority they know of that they think you can appeal to. Of course, we can all appeal to God, and God is the ultimate authority. But our founders recognize that, and the founders of these nations, which deteriorate into totalitarian states and are not a pleasant place to be in, they don't recognize and acknowledge that. And so there's really an important battle here, because quite frankly, there are a lot of politicians today and even popular speakers and so forth who essentially are trying to bring us down toward that totalitarian road, not the Judeo-Christian road. And so we've seen it in the pandemic. It's almost like you could take look at America, map of America, and the different states, and you could see where was the freedom the most. Well, it was in the states, where they recognized the religious liberty, the Judeo-Christian heritage, where they were more pro-life, et cetera, versus the states that were more totalitarian, where, frankly, some of the rulers, took advantage, it would seem to me, of the pandemic in order to restrict the freedom of their subjects. And, even that idea, well, we're not subjects, we're citizens here in this country.
Yes.
Thanks to these founding fathers that sacrificed so much. George Washington, by the way, just sacrificed so much.
Yes, he did.
So that we could be free, his posterity could be free. And he freed his slaves by the end of his life, which, by the way, as a fourth-generation slave owner, that was almost an unthinkable act, but a wonderful thing for him to do. And he pushed away power when he had the opportunity to. He served his country, but wanted to get back to his own, farm. And he had a vision for America, which came directly from the Bible, from Micah 4:4, that every man could sit down under his own vine and fig tree. That was his metaphor for what America could be and should be. And he wrote beautiful letters to clergymen, and including the synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, where he's talking about how here in America, people are free, including the children of Abraham, to enjoy these blessings and these freedoms. But this is all hard-won and hard-fought freedoms. And Washington and his troops, they suffered and they prevailed, but they trusted in God. And Washington said over and over and over, without God's help, we never would have become an independent nation. And no people should be more grateful than those of the United States. And today, Kerby, we have a nation, many of them are ingrates, and that's a shame. That's because they don't know their history, and they don't know the sacrifices men like George Washington made in order that we might be free.
And I might just mention again, this is part of the life and faith of George Washington, and it's the new film. It's coming out right now, and you have a chance to watch it. The previous one I would also recommend to you, of the Pilgrims documentary, is part of this Liberty series, which is part of our good friends there at Providence Forum. But just before I go, I thought I'd ask you another question. It's a little off topic, but it's relevant, and that is, what do you think about this issue of cohabitation?
Well, I just wrote a column about it.
Yes, you did.
Some people think that living in sin before they get married, they won't call it living in sin. But anyway, they think living together is a way to prepare for marriage. Statistically, it shows that no, it's a way to prepare for divorce. And that the people who actually save themselves, including their sexuality, for marriage, they have a much higher, happier marriage rate and less of a divorce rate. So I think it's important for people to realize that. And in fact, we quote in that article a study where 50,000 couples, they looked at the marriage and divorce patterns of 50,000 women specifically in America. And in fact, there was a Wall Street Journal article about it that I cited. And so it's important for people to realize, follow God's rules, and life is much, much better. As Jesus said, I have come that they might have life and have it more abundantly, and that includes our approach to relationships.
And I might just mention that we have posted that article. It's called Cohabitation, Preparation for Failure, and it is written by Jerry Newcombe, and I wanted to do that, one, because it came out today, two, because I think it is really important, Jerry, to point out that many of the people that have done some of these studies are people that would not necessarily be able to sign the doctrinal statement of D. James Kennedy or of our churches. These are individuals oftentimes that are very secular people who nevertheless are coming to biblical conclusions and saying that if you actually engage in living together before married, are involved in premarital sex before you get married, it increases your divorce rate, some estimate, by as much as an additional 50%. So you have this mindset today that says, look, you wouldn't buy a pair of shoes without trying them on. You wouldn't buy a car without a test drive. So obviously you need to live together before you get married. And the answer, coming even from people that wouldn't agree with us theologically or even politically, is no, that's really kind of dangerous. So I wanted to, again, salute you for writing that article. And when you actually go there, you'll find many of the other articles that our good friend Jerry Newcombe has written. And I look forward to seeing you in just about a month, because we're going to be at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention. You're going to be sitting across from us, and we'll be celebrating 50 years of Point of View, and we'll be celebrating all the work that you've done as the longest lasting employee of D. James Kennedy's ministry. So it is always great to have you with us. And again, point us to places where we can find some of this information.
ProvidenceForum.org. I'm making that the kind of the clearinghouse for all information about this foundation series. And then also djameskennedy.org has the articles that we do and the television programs produced by D. James Kennedy Ministries.
Again,
we'll do our best to be at that NRB, but I congratulate you on 50 years of broadcasting. That's fantastic.
Well, thank you.
And I know, and in fact, I'm going to put in a request that you do an interview for the ministry, too, when you're there.
Very good. Well, we will do that. And again, let me just mention, this is the article that came out today in WND, worldnetdaily.com, and we have all the information you need on Providence Forum. So, Jerry, thank you for joining us. We're going to come back and get into some of those issues, one of which is, how is it that the Prime Minister can use something like the Emergencies Act? Well, the bottom line is that their government was not founded on some of the principles that our government was. Basically, Canadian government comes from the British government. And so these ideas that we take for granted, like checks and balances and limitations to executive power, they really don't exist up in Canada. That's why that's happening. We'll talk about that right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Want to look first at this issue of what I call Trudeau and the truckers, and we'll get into that and also some of the other issues that we've posted. I have an article that we've posted for you to read by Carolyn Downey. We also have one that I'm going to quote from by Kevin Williamson, and maybe even get to one by Bob Unruh. If we have time this half hour, I am pretty sure we'll get to the piece we've also posted by Stephen Moore looking at the pandemic. We might talk a little bit about the latest on the investigation by Special Counsel John Durham and even Ukraine. And if we don't get to all of that, we certainly will have a chance by the end of the week to do so. I mentioned just a minute ago that there is an interesting connection, if you will, between what we've just been discussing with Jerry Newcombe and what's going on in Canada. And that is, you have a prime minister in Canada and a parliament. So it is very different in some ways from what we have here in the United States. This particular government in Canada came from the British government, and in many cases, they are very similar. There are some differences, but those are insignificant to the point I want to make. And that is, people have been shocked that all of a sudden the prime minister, that's Justin Trudeau, has shown what seems like kind of almost authoritarian or totalitarian actions. There is this authoritarian impulse that I think we have seen for some time, but he's used what is called the Emergencies Act, which, by the way, has never been used before. If you read it, you would think it would really deal with a major emergency, a major terrorist attack, maybe even a war, and yet this is something that does give the administration special authority for at least 30 days to restrict movement, to freeze financial accounts, including even personal bank accounts, and as we'll get into in just a minute, cryptocurrency transactions and a number of other things, and then to be able to direct actions to various citizens. In other words, you then have to can force tow trucks to tow the trucks, even if they were to decline to do that. And this, I think, is important to remember, because this was an act that could have been used when you had the kind of crowds that existed when Black Lives Matter showed up on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, but it was not used. As a matter of fact, just the opposite. He went out and greeted those individuals. But this one has also allowed them very easily to then close down bank accounts. And the deputy prime minister and minister of finance just the other day gave this very chilling statement. As of today, a bank or other financial service provider will be able to immediately freeze or suspend an account without a court order. Think about this. You don't even have to go to a judge to prove that this particular individual has done something wrong. Now, think about that for just a minute. Whether you like the truckers or not, this is really an issue much broader than and much more significant than that. And then goes on to say, in so doing, they will be protected against civil liability for actions taken in good faith. So, in other words, banks and financial institutions now can freeze or suspend an account without a court order. And if they do something wrongfully, an innocent person gets tapped. Maybe you said, well, what's the name of that trucker? I'm going to suspend his account. And that name, John Smith, is another John Smith. And that John Smith, who isn't even there in Ottawa, isn't even a trucker, has his account suspended. Can you see where that goes? Okay, I just wanted you to get that very quickly. Now, what you've also, of course, seen is there was an attempt to try to gather support from Canadians and, of course, even Americans to support the truckers, or to at least provide them with fuel and food and some things like that. And of course, we have the GoFundMe platform, which was completely drained, and we've talked about some of the others. We'll get into that more in just a minute. And so what you have ultimately now, as we point out here, is the government can exercise the Emergency Act only if there's a crisis that cannot adequately be solved by the local regions of the country, or by any existing federal legislation. This is why some people said, look, even if you are convinced, and we'll talk about whether or not the truckers broke the law, but even if you are convinced that they did, even if you are convinced that they are a hazard, could you not have had the mayor or other individuals, tap on the window and say, move your truck or we're going to tow it? And of course, this has just been, again, an incredible reach of power. So then you have some of the other questions that have been raised. If indeed you are convinced that this is about the mandates, and it's certainly not about the vaccinations. The argument that these are anti-vaxxers doesn't wash, because I've seen some estimate that 86% of the truckers are vaccinated. Another estimate came down the other day from another researcher saying it's probably more than 90% that have been vaccinated. So it's not about the vaccines, but it's about the mandates. And it's about having to show my card and having to feel like I always have to have a passport as a trucker to travel around from the different provinces in Canada, and then especially have to show something that looks like a vaccination passport to go from Canada to the United States to deliver some goods. Well, anyway, that's what got it started. And of course, what is now becoming even more significant is the attempt to close off the money. Well, Kevin Williamson put it this way: Justin Trudeau may be the best thing to happen to crypto since Satoshi Nakamoto. Now, if you don't know who that is, that's the pseudonymous, the anonymous, I guess you could say, individual that is associated with the establishment of Bitcoin. But the point is that you have these emergency orders. In this case, Justin Trudeau is not sending in the troops, but he is cutting off the money. And so he takes on this issue. Kevin Williamson puts it this way: Trudeau says the protests are illegal. That's not quite right. He says the protests are not illegal per se, though some of the protesters certainly are breaking the law, for instance, by blocking public roads and the like. The obvious parallel is the 2020 Black Lives Matter protest in Canada, which also included some law breaking. Trudeau did not invoke Emergency Measures Act powers to suppress those protests, even though they brought together large crowds during a particularly dangerous phase of the COVID-19 epidemic, contrary to the advice of Trudeau's government. So if indeed you see what is happening now is dangerous, roll back 2 years ago when there was really a concern that any kind of crowd like this would be a super spreader event. And we didn't have any kind of reaction back then like we have now. Also, he points out, and that is Kevin Williamson points out, that we're starting to see more and more in which the dealing with the money is the way to deal with any kind of potential challenge to kind of an authoritarian impulse. And it takes us back to 1933 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt used emergency powers back then. Do we see a pattern here? To seize all the gold in private hands in the United States in order to fortify the Federal Reserve. But he points out that technological changes have now made such schemes more insidious. Paper money can be stuffed into mattresses, coins can be buried into coffee cans, but when money is electronic, Kevin Williamson says, and the information architecture enables more financial transactions, is heavily regulated and easily subjected to invasive surveillance, then financial regulators enjoy powers that no FDR or Napoleon or Lenin ever dreamt of possessing. The opportunity for mischief are serious and worrisome, and so are the opportunities, he says, for tyranny. And he says, we live in a time where we've always said, we don't want book burning. He says, well, we don't burn forbidden books. Now Amazon just takes any politically inconvenient books, and those works just sort of disappear. We don't lock up people for having wrong political beliefs, but we do make sure that they cannot earn a living, go to school, raise their children in peace, and we don't have to send men with jackboots and billy clubs to break up protests. We have very polite Canadian bankers to do that for us. So it illustrates again, in this digital world, unless you have a decentralized digital currency like a Bitcoin or something of that nature, it is all too easy to come after those individuals. And just the other day, the Christian crowdfunding website Give, Send, Go, it was hacked so that they could prevent, first of all, that money from reaching the truckers, but then even more ominous, and it reminds us again of some of the things we've talked about in terms of cancel culture. There is a website called Distributed Denial of Secrets, which has megabytes of donor information and now is going to release that information to reporters and researchers. And so you know what will happen next. Those individuals will be doxxed. Some of those individuals, maybe because they supported the truckers, will be fired, or they will not be promoted. And you can see in this digital world of surveillance how dangerous some of that has become. Anyway, just a quick summary of some of the things happening up in Canada. When we come back, we'll also take a look at what happened during the pandemics and lockdowns. Talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention next hour we're going to have Shannon Bream with us and then E.W. Jackson. A lot to cover in the next hour. But just before we finish off this hour, I wanted to, first of all, point to my commentary today, which is called The Great Confinement. That phrase comes from Arthur Herman. I got a feeling that's going to be a title of a new book, but we get a chance to get a little bit of a preview because he argues that these first 2 years here in the 2020s, if you will, probably could be called the Great Confinement. And as a result, just as the Great Depression in the 1930s changed the political landscape, he argues that the Great Confinement of 2020 to 2022 in this midterm election and maybe even in the presidential election in 2024 will change the political landscape as well. So that's the commentary that is there for you to read today. But my article that we've posted comes from Stephen Moore, individual that, of course, has been looking at the economic issues for many years with the Wall Street Journal, National Review, was an advisor for a time to Donald Trump and the rest. And the title of it is simply, Under the Pandemic and Lockdowns, the Rich Got Richer and the Poor Got Crushed. And I think it's important to understand what took place, if for no other reason than to make sure that if we ever are threatened with another pandemic, and we may still be dealing with some of this in the future, that we can learn some of these lessons from what we've experienced over the last 2 years. And so Stephen Moore says, today, 2 years after COVID-19 first hit these shores from China, most studies confirm that the heavy-handed government lockdowns of businesses, restaurants, schools, churches, and parks did more harm than good to our health and well-being. Matter of fact, in my commentary, I talk about what I call the 3 E's: economic, educational, and emotional. And of course, we know how that plays out. He talks about the fact that shutting down the economy hurt the poor the most and vastly widened the chasm between rich and poor. Lockdowns squashed small startup businesses, hurt low-income workers whose jobs were first in line to be destroyed, and devastated educational advances of children in the worst school districts. For example, we've learned that high-achieving children did fine with remote learning. However, those who scored below average in school performance or came from low-income families without computer skills tended to tune out and shut down online lessons completely. We know that some of them never even turned on their computer. That was a new piece of information that I did not have there. We can go on and on about the economic devastation and certainly the educational devastation. And of course, he doesn't talk about what we have on this program, talked about the emotional devastation. But some people did very well. Some corporations did very well. And so he asked the question, well, who were the winners of the lockdown nation? He says, well, let's start with the corporate giants. And those would be Walmart, Google, Amazon, Walgreens, Apple, McDonald's, obviously Pfizer, Goldman Sachs, etc. They were rewarded with the designation of essential by the politicians. Their doors stayed open. They raked in dollars by the millions. And he says, you don't have to take my word for it, because the headline from MarketWatch, Big Tech's pandemic year produces mind-boggling financial rewards and results. So he says, first of all, we learn that the big businesses scored a $1.4 trillion, with a T, $1.4 trillion payday during the pandemic. And Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, the so-called FANG stocks, increased their profits by 45% last year. And you can see why some people saying, yeah, bring back the pandemics, because of that being the case. Then there's the nugget from the front pages of the New York Times. Wealth inequality is the highest since World War II. Well, guess what? You know, George Soros, he says, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, they won the lottery. He said, don't get me wrong, I'm not a basher of big tech or big pharma. On the contrary, I love raising in a rising stock market. But if firms make great products that people want, hooray for capitalism, everyone's better off. But here you can see some of the concerns, and he goes into some detail. Under the pandemic, the rich got richer and the poor got poorer, and income inequality increased dramatically, which I think is a reason to reevaluate everything that's unfolded over these last 2 years. And one of the reasons why it parallels very much with my commentary I wrote a couple of weeks ago that airs now today, called The Great Confinement. Just before out of time, I do want to at least go a little bit more into what we're learning right now in terms of the investigation. We announced just the other day that the special counsel, John Durham, actually was able to unravel this web of corruption, which in some respects justified and was actually providing a way for the deep state to spy on Donald Trump and others. The court filings by, again, John Durham contain, as Gary Bauer Bauer points out, earth-shattering accusations. And if he can prove his case, this may be the biggest political scandal in America's history. So, Gary Bauer may not be as want and likely to use hyperbole as, say, Donald Trump. Even he's making those kinds of statements. What we have learned from previous court filings, of course, was that there were researchers at Georgia Tech, which were part of a conspiracy to falsely smear Donald Trump as first a candidate, then, of course, later as the president, as being nothing more than a puppet of Russia. We now see that they were monitoring servers in Trump Tower, and they were trying to falsely connect private internet data from Trump Tower to a Russian bank. We've talked about that before. We also know that there was an executive in the tech company who was doing the bidding of the Clinton campaign and was hoping to land a key appointment in Hillary Clinton's administration. Of course, we can talk about that later, and probably will on Friday. What's even more concerning is the fact that we're starting to see that the CIA may have been involved in one way or another, because you have a contract that would actually be used to then actually deal with the White House computer systems. And that's a contract that would have to go to a company that would have the highest security clearance, one that now could likely have been awarded during the Obama-Biden administration by the Secretary of State, who was Hillary Clinton. And so this is something that is greatly concerning to individuals as well. And the special counsel alleges that people in this company were monitoring the White House computer system, passing information on to Hillary Clinton's operatives, and then fed fake information to the CIA after the election. In other words, they were spying on Donald Trump, and that did not end when he became president of the United States. And Fox News reports that some of the fabricated internet data was intended to suggest that Trump and or his associates were supposedly in some way or another connected up to the Russians. And of course, we've heard a lot about the Russian investigation. And I think another investigation needs to be brought, because you had, remember, former special counsel Robert Mueller and his team of lawyers, many of which were sympathetic to Hillary Clinton, spent months and months and months investigating Donald Trump on fake charges of colluding with Russia. And in that period of time, they never uncovered any information that we now see John Durham uncovering. Was it possible that some of that was actually thrown away? I mean, there are just lots and lots of questions. And as somebody the other day said, this is an important story because the New York Times and the Washington Post told us it's not an important story. I thought that was a good line. And so we will continue following this, and there is much more to come. And again, we always assume people are innocent till proven guilty, but John Durham would not have these court filings if he didn't have the evidence. And certainly somebody, quite a few people, have to go to jail, and we'll see what unfolds in that regard. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with Shannon Bream. She has one book out on the Women of Bible Speak. She's got another one coming out, but also want to get some of her thoughts as a lawyer and an individual as the chief legal correspondent for Fox News. Got a lot of important Supreme Court cases coming down, and we've also posted an article from her speech at Liberty University about how she had to deal with depression and how God used that in her life. We'll have more to talk about right after this.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
We begin this hour with a conversation with Shannon Bream. You might remember the conversation we had with her last year as we talked about her book, The Women of the Bible Speak, the wisdom of 16 women and their lessons for today. In just a few minutes, we'll also be talking with her about a book coming out called The Mothers and Daughters of the Bible Speak, Lessons on Faith from 9 Biblical Families. Also want to get some of her thoughts as the individual who's the chief legal correspondent for Fox News, because of all these important Supreme Court cases that we talk about so often on Friday with Kelly Shackelford or other people with First Liberty, and a number of other topics. And we've posted an article that comes from Liberty University, Liberty Journal, which she actually spoke there about finding light in the darkness of depression. So lots to cover. Again, Shannon Bream is the anchor for Fox News Channel's Fox News at Night with Shannon Bream, individual that, of course, has been involved in the process of really communicating lots of great information from Fox News, a graduate at Liberty University, also with a law degree at Florida State University College of Law. And Shannon, welcome back to Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me, Kerby.
Let's, if we can, for just a minute, mention your book that came out last year, because you talk about the women of the Bible speak, and I've used it recently when we've been talking about the importance of having courage in really speaking to this culture that needs to hear from Christian voices. And I've borrowed some of the material you have here from the story of Esther, because that is just one of a number of women that you have picked out of the Old Testament in particular, but also a few in the New Testament, to illustrate the fact that we can get some great role models as we are speaking to the culture and as we are wanting to live a godly life. So how's that book doing? Because we talked with you about it last year, and I know it's been out almost a year now.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I don't think we ever could have guessed how it would resonate with people, how they'd connect with it. And I hear from folks all over the world, mostly women, but some men too, who talk about how they've studied it alone or with a group or in a Bible study with church or book club. And I just love that for some reason people have really been responsive to it. I think, these stories have always been tucked into the Bible, and maybe it's just that there hasn't been this exact kind of platform for taking out these stories and making sure that people know them and see how God values women and use them all through history and continues to. So people have connected with it. We couldn't be happier. It's now going into several different languages, and I just find that really, hopefully it'll be encouraging to people all over the world.
And I have noticed that, especially in the Old Testament, where you have more character development, we know a little bit about Peter, a little bit about Paul, John, and others, but you learn a lot about individuals in the Old Testament, and it not only helps you, Shannon, learn about what we should do, but virtually every person that you identify there had some flaws, so you not only learn how to actually live the godly Christian life, but you also maybe can learn some lessons vicariously of what not to do. And so you talk about some of those mistakes as well, don't you?
I do, and we do in the new book, too. I think it's important, and it should be so comforting to all of us, because, listen, I'm a sinner saved by grace. I am humbled by that and the mistakes I've made and the choices I've made, that God has such great mercy on us, and He wants us to come to Him, and He wants to redeem and help us and shepherd us forward. He has, undying, unconditional love for us. And Christ didn't come here to condemn. He came with truth, but He also came to redeem, and He wanted to save and seek and save the lost. So I love that through these women's stories, even when they make terrible, bad turns or bad life choices, that God can work through it, and these women still end up in the genealogy of Christ, they end up being leaders and models whose lives inspire us even now. And certainly with that message that God loves us, flaws and all. Thank goodness.
Yes, we wouldn't put some of them in the genealogy, but yet you find them in the book of Hebrews. Let's talk about the new book, because I know you'll be at National Religious Broadcasters. We'll be broadcasting from there, but I know you're doing an event with KCBI, and your book is coming out later next month, and it's Mothers and Daughters of the Bible, Lessons on Faith from 9 Biblical Families. Now, when I've preached on this before, especially when I get into Genesis, I call it broken branches on your family tree, because whether you look at Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, whether you look at Sarah, you look at, it's just amazing, all the examples that we have. You can, again, learn some good lessons about passing on faith from one generation to the next, but you also recognize that sometimes the sins of one generation end up on the sins of the next generation, and really call for those of us that are parents or grandparents to lead a godly life, because those kids are always watching us.
It's so true. And listen, I think about, somebody like Rebecca. We read about this amazing, beautiful love story that she and Isaac have. When they start off, Abraham has sent his top person to go find a wife for Isaac, knowing all the promises that God had for him and the generations to come. And he goes and we get into the details of Rebecca's story, how she was discovered, and all the miracles and the way that God was so divinely leading to that in their marriage. And it starts off so great, and you think, okay, these people have everything in the world going for them. And then they go years without a child. So often we see these stories of infertility in the Bible. And then they do end up having 2 sons. And what happens there, as one became mom's favorite, one became dad's favorite, and the backstabbing and the manipulation that happens there. Mothers are flawed in the Bible too. Sometimes they make good decisions and bad decisions, and we look at Rebecca as a mother and what flowed through that. So yes, the choices that we make really have consequences for generations to come, good and bad, but they can be redeemed, and we see that as well.
Well, and again, when you mentioned Rebecca, it also reminds me of Hannah. I wrote a book years ago on genetics, and I honestly thought that when the book came out that people would be asking questions about all the genetic engineering. Nope, what it was is I'd had just one chapter there about artificial reproduction, and I was starting to hear from all the modern-day Hannahs that because infertility strikes at least 10% of the people in your church and in your community, these were individuals that were, in a sense, having some of the same kind of experiences that you write about in your book. And I think it's just a good illustration of a way in which we can use this in an effective way. But we need to take a break. Let me just mention real quickly, the book is entitled The Mothers and Daughters of the Bible Speak. Now, it'll be coming out shortly, but you can probably order it ahead of time and get it. And I think you're really going to benefit from this. Lessons on Faith from 9 Biblical Families. And Shannon, you did mention the fact that with the Women of the Bible Speak, that first one, you've had a lot of people do small group studies. So this is one of those topics, and this one of those books coming out again that would just be a great Bible study for people that maybe want to learn a little bit more about what is written about in some of these stories of women and their families, mothers and daughters in the Bible, isn't it?
Yeah, and we include study questions. I always love those myself, so I made sure to write those with each of these chapters too, because I learn from discussion with other people. They're going to have different perspectives, different life experiences. And when you read the scriptures, I think all of us oftentimes, we read a scripture or a story that you've read many times, and you get something new or fresh or different from it when you study it again. And I think in a group that really helps as well. So if you want to do study questions or alone or with a group, a book club, a Bible study, they're there for you in the book. And hopefully that makes it easier to dig in a little bit and find the applications for your own life.
Well, again, Women of the Bible Speak and Mothers and Daughters of the Bible Speak. We'll come back, and I want to get just a couple of thoughts from an individual that is the chief legal correspondent. We have more Supreme Court cases that we have been following this year than seemingly any other time. And then I'll also have posted a very good piece that came out in Liberty Journal, a news anchor, Shannon Bream, on finding light in the darkness of depression. She shared that with them, and I thought maybe she could share a few thoughts with us as well. Let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
The Great Depression took place in the 1930s. Arthur Herman suggests that we refer to the first 2 years of the 2020s as the Great Confinement. He argues that just as the Great Depression changed the political landscape, so the Great Confinement will do the same in the next few years. We may be on the verge of a significant political realignment. The Great Depression destroyed American voters' faith in Wall Street and big business. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt described those stranded by the Great Depression as the forgotten man, while he and other Democrats were swept into office. The Great Confinement, in the form of lockdowns and mandates, might have a similar impact in the opposite way. Voters have lost faith in the basic competence of government. This time, the party out of office will enjoy the benefit of voter frustration. Roosevelt talked about the forgotten man. This time, the Great Confinement has created a nation of forgotten Americans. Polls already show a political and philosophical shift. 2/3 of Americans feel the country is on the wrong track. A recent Axios poll found that 2/3 of Republicans and more than 4 in 10 of Democrats said that they are fearful of what will unfold in 2022. I divide the cost of confinement into the 3 E's: economy, education, emotional. The economic cost of the pandemic and lockdowns is estimated at $16 trillion. Studies of student performance document the devastating impact of the lockdowns on learning and student achievement, and the emotional toll can be seen in the rising levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. Add to these statistics the rising crime rates and rising inflation rates, and you can see how we may indeed be on the verge of a political realignment. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Shannon Bream. Again, she is the chief legal correspondent for Fox News. Also, you might want to catch her podcast, Living the Bream, which is on Fox News Radio, where she shares all sorts of inspirational stories and anecdotes, and maybe even looks a little bit at some of the actions and rulings of the High Court. And so I'd like to have you maybe put your lawyer's hat on for just a minute, because we have a lot of really important cases coming down. And I don't know if it's just because we have people like Kelly Shackelford in here all the time, and we have other people that are lawyers, but we're talking about cases having to do with abortion and religious liberty and school choice and Second Amendment. I can't remember a time in which we had so many, if you will, sort of high-profile cases that all will actually, hopefully, be resolved by June. What are your thoughts?
Those really hot terms that we would say, they run from October to June. Usually, sometimes they bleed a little bit into July, but certainly the biggest abortion case in decades, really since Roe v. Wade. I think you could argue this case out of Mississippi, the Dobbs case, which essentially there's a state law there that bans most abortions after 15 weeks. So the court had arguments over that. They were very interesting. And I think that, you know, the question is, will they uphold that Mississippi law? And then will they go more broadly after some of the underpinnings of Roe v. Wade? And that's what we're waiting to find out, because I think most people watching the court that day felt like that Mississippi law is likely to be upheld, but that's just kind of one part of the question or the process. I think we all now wait to see if the court goes more broadly after that decision that essentially legalized abortion across the U.S. What's interesting, too, is that a number of states have so-called trigger laws in place. Your listeners probably
Yes.
know about this, where if Roe v. Wade is overturned, there are some states that will immediately codify it, meaning making sure that abortion is available on demand in their states. Other states that will really crack down and essentially outlaw elective abortions in their states. So this really sends, if they do chip away at Roe, it will send the issue back to the states. Just so people are clear, it doesn't mean if they strike down Roe that abortion is no longer available in America, but it's going to be much more decided on a state-by-state basis if they go there.
Well, again, even though we broadcast across the nation, I do remind people that where I'm broadcasting right now is in the state of Texas, and we had a heartbeat bill that became a heartbeat law. And a lot of people say, well, what would that be like if indeed Roe versus Wade was overturned and it went back to the states? We've actually seen how that has played itself out in this state. So in some respects, people can look at that. Some of the other particular cases, of course, religious liberty related to Coach Kennedy, a school choice case out of Maine, which could be very significant, and a variety of others. So this is a time in which you don't know which will be, because they always like to take the most controversial cases and rule on those last. But I guess abortion might be the last one we'll hear about in June. But it's amazing how many really important cases are before the High Court this year.
They are, and you mentioned the case of Coach Kennedy, which they're taking up out of Washington State. And, you know, this is a coach that this case has been back and forth. It's been all over the place for years. And, you know, his supporters will say, listen, this is a coach who decided to pray by himself on the 50-yard line after games. He had committed to himself and to God if that was something he was going to do, regardless of how the game went. You know, the detractors argue here, listen, kids felt pressure that they had to pray along with him. Kids were involved sometimes. He led prayers involving the kids, and that's not something a public school teacher should be doing. So this case has bounced around for years, and I think it's really important that the highest court has now taken it, and it will be so interesting to see how this finally wraps up. You mentioned there's the school choice issue and, you know, about student aid programs, whether they should be available to students who want to go to private schools or religious schools. So, yeah, a lot of freedom of religion kind of questions that are bubbling around for sure.
Sure. Our listeners up in Maine are familiar with that, and we have talked about it before. But I would be remiss if I didn't also mention the fact that I think I saw you the other day saying that you were out walking your dog Biscuit, and your phone blew up because they said Stephen Breyer is stepping down. Actually, I don't think he made that announcement, but that's something else about the court, because it's rare that we have too many confirmation hearings, but certainly one coming down once we have the current president, Joe Biden, tell us which of these, I guess it's supposed to be African-American women, he's going to put forward. What about that?
Yeah, you know, we have sort of a short list of who we know they're seriously considering, and it was a promise he made during the campaign before he was elected, and the White House says he's going to make good on that. And listen, the women who are on the list that we've been reviewing, these are people who are highly educated, federal judges, many of them, not all of them, some of them academics or have other credentials. But, you know, there's this feeling that you don't want whomever is picked, whether you agree with their ideology or judicial philosophy or not, you don't want them to be minimized in that people think, well, you were chosen based on this criteria of sex and race, you know, versus these excellent qualifications you absolutely do have. So, you know, there's that conversation about these women and, you know, making sure that they are fully vetted and considered and get a fair shake through this confirmation process. Listen, every president picks somebody for the court, if they get the chance, who lines up with their particular judicial philosophy. So this is not going to be someone that's going to get any kind of overwhelming Republican support, but probably will get, you know, 3 to 5 votes, maybe depending on who is picked. But yeah, when you're out running with a dog and you're 2 miles away from home and get a call that a Supreme Court justice is retiring, you make a record time back to the house.
Yeah, the dog got drugged back. But anyway, it's a great story.
He did.
But just before we go, I thought it would be really encouraging for people that maybe were not familiar with the fact that, of course, you're a graduate of Liberty University. And when you were brought back to speak, news anchor Shannon Bream on finding light in the darkness of depression. One of the things, Shannon, we've been doing is talking more about emotional issues. We've had Sheila Walsh on and all sorts of individuals, and I thought it was just a very encouraging piece that they wrote up, and you were quite willing to share your vulnerability because people looking at you saying, you know, you're smart, you're articulate, you're beautiful, you are, you know, well-placed. You probably have never had a problem in your life, and yet you were quite transparent and vulnerable about some times in which you actually had to deal with some pretty significant issues as well.
Yeah, and I think we're all going to be there. We've all been there, or we love somebody who is going through this. And I thought, especially college-age kids are really struggling these days. And our young people, I think, do need to see the reality that, listen, life is not a perfect Instagram feed. We all, curate what we put out there into the world. It's our very best selfie or life event or whatever it is. But the truth is we all struggle and we all go through things. God knows that, and we're reminded that we have a high priest in Christ who came and walked and took on human flesh. He understands what our struggles are like, our temptations are like, and what our failings are like. I mean, he was here without sin, but he knows that, and he is not above or apart understanding our suffering, our struggles. And so I think it's important to be transparent that, yeah, I have bad days. I make bad decisions. I've been through chronic living with chronic pain, which was, forced me into a very dark place of depression.
Yes.
And I just think, we shouldn't feel like as Christians that is a sinful thing. I mean, we all struggle. And I think if we're afraid to admit that, then we miss the opportunity to help others.
Well, again, I just thought it would be such an encouraging piece. It's easy to read. You may even know somebody that would want to know more about that, so we will forward it on. And one last time, let me just mention that, of course, you can go back to the interview we did, I think it was in April, on the Women of the Bible Speak, a great conversation we had with Shannon Bream on the wisdom of 16 women and their lessons for today, and one that's coming out at the end of next month, the Mothers and Daughters of the Bible Speak, Lessons on Faith from 9 Biblical Families. And Shannon, we appreciate the great work you do at Fox News and appreciate the fact that you've been writing these books, and I hope you continue, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you so much.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we will spend a little bit of time getting into one more issue. I'm sure that you are probably by now saying, you've covered a lot of topics. Yes, we got a couple more to go. E.W. Wilson will be with us, and of course, he is an individual that actually has been speaking on some of these issues. He is a fellow broadcaster. Matter of fact, he will join us at the National Religious Broadcasters. We'll get a chance to sit across from him and get some comments from him as well. But also, we have a link to the STAND Foundation. That stands for Staying True to America's National Destiny. And he's had some really strong comments about everything from legalizing drugs to passing out crack pipes. If you haven't heard about that, I'm sure he will educate us on that. And then we might get into a little bit more because he's also done quite a bit of study on things like critical race theory and the rest. So I just wanted you to have a chance to hear from him. And of course, those of you that listen on American Family Radio are quite familiar with his broadcast, but for some of you, maybe not. And as an individual that ran for the lieutenant governor's position in Virginia back in 2013. He had some things to say about Virginia wanting to legalize drugs, and we will get into those topics with him. And as always, if you'd like to join us, we have always been wanting to encourage your phone calls, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. The article about Shannon Bream, it is from liberty.edu, but we've made it very easy for you to find. We've talked about the impact of the pandemic and the lockdowns, the Trudeau and the truckers, cohabitation, and even depression. We've covered all sorts of topics today here on Point of View. We'll cover a few more right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we're going to have a chance now to chat with E.W. Jackson, who is actually my wife's favorite broadcaster, present company excluded, but he is going to be with us also at the National Religious Broadcasters. So, E.W., if this blonde comes up and gives you a big hug, you'll know that you've got a fan or two that is in our family as well. He's an individual that, of course, you probably, if you're listening to American Family Radio, already know. The Awakening. Of course, E.W. has been on with us before and will, of course, be with us at NRB, but a graduate. First of all, he served in the United States Marines, and thank him for that service, but also then graduated from the University of Massachusetts, as well as from Harvard Law School. We, of course, you can send you to the Awakening at AFR, but we also have a link to STAND Foundation, which stands for Staying True to America's National Destiny. And we have that link on our website. Of course, a couple of books that you may be familiar with, 10 Commandments to an Extraordinary Life and 12 Principles to Make Your Life Extraordinary. Of course, the show host at American Family Radio also ran as the nominee for the Lieutenant Governor in the state of Virginia, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, back in 2013. So, EW, welcome back to Point of View.
Well, thanks, Kerby. I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I thought, first of all, we would get your thoughts about drugs because, of course, I mentioned that you ran for the nomination in Virginia, and yet when we had in Virginia the decision to legalize marijuana a number of months ago, I remember you had some pretty strong things to say about that. And then the other day on your program, you talked about crack pipes, and we really have not talked about that issue, but this issue of drugs alone is a real concern, and it's an illustration again why we need to have clear thinking by those people that serve in office.
Yeah, I think, frankly, Kerby, with the rise of an authoritarian mindset in our country where elites think that it's important that they be able to order and command the American people to do what they want them to do without any constitutional authority, and often, as we're learning, without even the scientific authority they claim they have. It's very important that the American people be sober. It's very important that the American people be clear-eyed, because I think tyrants, potential tyrants, love it when people are inebriated and half high. And so, I mean, from a strictly political perspective, it's important, but obviously from a spiritual perspective, you know, we need wisdom to navigate very difficult times, and we just don't need people influenced by drugs that change their consciousness and alter their perceptions, and I think have the potential to be a disaster. And look, we've 100,000 Americans killed by fentanyl last year. We've got crack cocaine, again, a sort of a rising new crack cocaine epidemic, something that in the 90s spurred on legislation that is now being called racist, but because the crack epidemic hit the black community harder than any other community, there was an attempt to deal with it, which in hindsight then was called a racist attempt to destroy black men. The drugs are simply a very, very unhealthy way for our society to go. Not to mention, we've got a state senator here in Virginia who has our own marijuana shop. So this kind of mainstreaming of drug use is a bad thing for the country.
And you said before that if you really want to look at problems, you know, stop talking about the Ku Klux Klan, which I'm not even sure how many there are, or skinheads or Proud Boys. I mean, we have policies right now that really are hurting the black family. And, of course, the black family is being affected by welfare programs and anti-poverty programs. But also, when you look at the issue of the drug culture and the rest, we should really be focusing on that. And yet, if you turn on a lot of the so-called establishment media or legacy media, they hardly even talk about those issues, which is one of the reasons why I encourage people to listen to you on radio, because you think these are important issues that are being ignored and really almost never even mentioned sometimes by the legacy media.
We have got, my organization is keeping a count, Kerby. We've counted 263 innocent children murdered since the death of George Floyd. They have not been murdered by Ku Klux Klansmen. They have not been murdered by police. They've been murdered by thugs running the streets. And those thugs, sadly, are often the young guys who grew up without fathers, enculturated by the streets, and now they've become the people who are terrorizing the very black folks that Black Lives Matter claims to care so much about, but they really don't, because these issues aren't discussed by them. They're discussed by the mainstream media because they don't fit the narrative. Because I'm convinced that the narrative is really not about helping the black community. It's about dismantling America as we know it and recreating it in some sort of warped pseudo-Marxist image of some kind. And I think Americans have got to stand up for the values of faith and family and freedom, because those are the values that really made America great, not this tribalism and tribalizing of the country that fractionalizes us and divides us and tries to keep us at each other.
One of the things I've learned from you is just how to kind of address this issue of critical race theory, and just how the left, as you say on your website, has convinced us that America is a nation of social injustice. We do have some very dark chapters in American history, whether it's slavery, Jim Crow, whether it's the Indian Wars, whatever. But to throw all of it out and not recognize some of those foundational principles that have made this country great is one of the great issues that we're dealing with today. And you're right, we are really such a divided nation, and there's a need to bring together this nation to really heal this nation and bring about racial reconciliation. But it doesn't seem to me that we're going to get that from the mainstream press right now, are we?
No, and the thing that I often point out to people is, you said there are dark chapters in our history, true, but Kerby, there are dark chapters in the world. I mean, America wasn't birthed in a vacuum. I mean, we're birthed in the world that we inherit. And that's been a world in which slavery has existed on every continent, in every country, among every people that's ever existed. But only one country has declared itself on the principle that our rights and our freedoms come from Almighty God and are inherent in us as human beings. And I, as an American who is a descendant of slaves, I've inherited that legacy. That's part of who I am now as an American. And so we can, I've often said to people, if you judged yourself or others judged you by the same way you judge our country, you wouldn't make it across the street, because all of us have made mistakes. All of us have things in our history that we wish we'd done differently. But we want people to look at the overall trajectory of our lives. I don't want people to just know me before I became a Christian. I want them to know me as a Christian and the life I've tried to live since I gave my life to Jesus Christ. Well, what about our country? I mean, you just want to know America based on his slavery and based on our interaction with Native Americans, or do you want to tell the whole story? And the whole story is one, in my view, more of nobility and transcending the things that could have drug us down than it is of dragging us through the mud.
Again, you can find a lot of this at standamerica.us. Of course, we have all those links on our website here. And again, that is part of an organization called the Stand Foundation. And maybe in a couple of minutes, I want to get into some of the things you're doing in terms of mobilizing people for the vote. You have, of course, the Vote the Rock and ministers taking a stand. But since you live in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and I've lived in there myself, you've got to be somewhat encouraged by seeing who is the governor and especially who's the lieutenant governor. Now, again, you ran as lieutenant governor. I wish it was you, but I think you would be pretty impressed with some of the people that have actually been able to win those elections, in part because of issues like critical race theory and all the things that were said about parents and the describing parents sometimes as domestic terrorists. What are your thoughts?
I am thrilled with the ticket that was elected in Virginia, and I'm grateful that we were able to play a role in that, because here's the untold story, the story that a lot of people don't know. We actually had a significant movement of black votes into the Republican column. We won 2 delegate seats that are majority black Democrat districts that were won by Republicans, because people didn't want to hear anybody tell them that they have no say in their children's education and that they should go off into a corner, sit down, and shut up. I don't think any parent wants to hear that, regardless of their background. And so we had a tsunami, a wave of people who hadn't been active and involved who voted. And then we had a lot of black folks who said, enough is enough. And I think we're going to see more of that. And so, yes, I mean, I know Winsome Sears personally, spent time with all of these candidates. They're wonderful people. They're Christian people, people who put God first. And I'm convinced that that's what we need more of, people who understand, who have a moral foundation that does not shift and change with the times, because I think that that's what is going to determine the future of our country.
Well, E.W. Jackson with us. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I do want to talk a little bit about these midterm elections. I know some of you are waiting to vote. I voted Monday. I mean, we already had early voting here in the state of Texas, but your time will come. And I want to talk about some of the things that are being done through the Stand Foundation to educate you and to mobilize you and to encourage you. So, again, if you'd like to join us, E.W. Jackson with us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back and spend some time chatting with him and getting some updates on what they are doing during these important midterm elections. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with E.W. Jackson. Again, if you'd like to know more about him, you can go to our website or go directly to standamerica.us. And E.W., I wanted to talk about the elections because in some respects that relates very much to what you've already been through in Virginia. As I mentioned, we are already in the state of Texas, for example, where I'm broadcasting from. I actually have a chance to vote. Our primaries are March 1st, but we broadcast in about almost 4 dozen states, and those are all over the map. In your case, Virginia doesn't vote till June 21st. So there's just lots of time right now for our listeners to begin to evaluate various candidates. And in some cases, the most important election isn't the general election, as important it is ultimately who is going to serve. A lot of the real battles take place in the primary. So now is the time to get educated about these various candidates. And I know you're involved in that with some of the organizations that you've been associated with.
Yes, indeed, and you're right. These elections are going to be, and I know we've been saying this a lot because it's been true with each election, are some of the most important that will ever take place. But there are some great signs. What happened in Virginia is a great sign. What just happened in San Francisco for the first time in history. They recalled 3 school board members, the 3 most radical people on the school board, and they knocked them off. So I think that every Christian, every conservative, every person who respects the Constitution and believes that we have a wonderful way of life in our country, of course they can be improved, but certainly doesn't need to be fundamentally transformed, has got to educate themselves about the candidates. And I say this, it's not enough to say to me, I'm a conservative, I'm a Republican. I want to know what those values that you claim to hold are rooted and grounded in. And of course, I believe with all my heart that if they're not rooted and grounded in truth, absolute truth, a sense that there are absolutes that are given to us by God that are not subject to compromise, not subject to repeal. Our founding fathers said we hold these truths, not opinions, not whims, but truths to be self-evident. If they're not rooted and grounded in that, but merely in theory and opinion and all of that, I wonder. I want people who I know when the winds blow, when the earth quakes, they're not going to move. Their position will remain rock solid on these most fundamental issues. So we're planning to be involved in these congressional elections, and we're going to focus. Our organization is going to focus on reaching blacks and other minorities to help them understand that they are being lied to, they're being manipulated, they're being indoctrinated with a lot of leftist garbage to try to convince them that America is the worst place in the world to live, when the fact is that America is the greatest place on earth for anybody to live, regardless of the color of your skin. And they need to start voting for people whose policies will actually help them instead of hurt them. And these leftist policies have done a devastating job on the inner city communities. I mean, they've created all this crime. The education system is absolutely horrible. Families breaking down as a result of the Great Society programs and ongoing welfare, incentivizing men to be out of the home and for single-parent families. I mean, it's a disaster, and it's time that people turned away from it, and I see it happening.
You know, in the last segment, you used the word tsunami, and it's kind of interesting because Dr. Merrill Matthews, who writes in The Hill and also is going to be on the program with us tomorrow, by the way, actually said that, you know, we've been talking about the possibility, obviously, of a red wave, and you think of 1994, in which you had just an enormous number of Republicans that were elected because of the contract with the America. 2010, again, the same kind of thing because of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. And of course, it's almost always been true that the party out of power tends to gain seats when the other party is in power. But some people are saying this may not be a red wave, but a red tsunami, because back in 1994, let's admit, Bill Clinton was a pretty gifted politician. And in 2010, Barack Obama was a pretty gifted politician. E.W. Jackson, I don't think people are using that kind of accolade right now for the current president, Joe Biden. And so this could be much more than just a red wave. It really could possibly be a red tsunami, couldn't it?
Well, look, I've said many, many times, Kerby, the crazier they get, even though it may be painful initially, the better it's going to be for us. Because I think they're waking up ordinary Americans who didn't pay that much attention to politics. And Democrat, Republican, not much difference. But I think they're seeing now policies like defund the police, dismantle the police, mask children 6 or 8 hours a day, whether parents like it or not, teach kindergartners that they may not be the gender their parents told them that they are, and then telling parents to shut up, you have nothing to say about it. I think people are realizing these folks should not be anywhere near the levers of power because they apparently don't care about the American people. They care about a political agenda that they have, and they don't care who they have to run over in order to implement it. And I think we are going to see a tsunami in November.
Let me just mention, too, one of the things that I really encourage people to check out is your website, but also it has a link to votetherock.com. Now, the rock is Vote Jesus, basically. But you remind us with some really sad statistics on the tens of millions of evangelical voters who had in the past sometimes have stayed home. So especially in a midterm election where the turnout isn't quite as great, it does seem to me that getting the church out is going to be the difference in making a difference in turning this nation around. What are your thoughts?
Oh, my goodness. I hear again, I think the more the church wakes up, do people remember that when one congressman stood up and read from the Bible what God says about this whole transgender and homosexual movement and all of that, Jerry Nadler said, God's will has no place in the United States Congress or on the floor of the United States Congress. And I thought, I hope every Christian in America hears that, because we would say God has a place everywhere. In fact, the more involved God is, the better things are. And yet we're being told, not here. We're not having God in our government. So I think Christians are going to have to realize that without us, this thing's going to spin completely out of control. So I trust that more and more Christians are awakening to the fact that our involvement is not just a good thing. It is an absolutely necessary thing to save this country.
Well, again, if you would like to know more about E.W. Jackson, if you'd like to, of course, follow him on American Family Radio, we have all sorts of links there on the website. But again, you might directly go to standamerica.us or find the link there and maybe check out a little bit more about this idea of actually voting the rock. And I think you'll appreciate all the great material that he's put together. And I look forward to seeing you face-to-face at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in a couple of weeks. And we'll get a chance to sit across from each other and broadcast live from there.
Yes, sir. I'm looking forward to that. It's going to be a great time.
Well, again, say hello to all our good friends at American Family Radio. And again, you've been hearing E.W. Jackson today, and he will give you a chance to really know a little bit more about some of these key issues. And I certainly do commend his broadcast as well, which, by the way, is usually on when this one is on. So sometimes you have to listen to one after the fact. And that's certainly a possibility as well, because they have all sorts of podcasts that they post. And, of course, we post ours as well. So if you didn't have a chance to hear the interview that we did earlier with Jerry Newcombe or the interview we did with Shannon Bream, or you'd like to hear again the one with E.W. Jackson, all available at the website. You can click on that red button that says watch or listen, and that way you can either watch it or you can go to the YouTube channel or listen to it and download the podcast, and it is all available to you. My Viewpoints commentary today is on the Great Confinement. I think just as the Great Depression kind of changed political realignments, I think the Great Confinement might do that as well. So I do encourage you to find some of that material, and all of it is available at our website at pointofview.net. I might just, as a program note, mention that Dr. Merrill Matthews will be here tomorrow, and then, of course, Friday we'll have Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford. We'll be talking about all of those very important issues. You can find out all of that at our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer. I want to thank Gracie as well as Steve for their help in producing this program, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.